Meanwhile, the protests and the looting that we're seeing linked in all sorts of ways to the problems that we have in our country, to our politics and to our poverty. In business terms, investors talk about what's called political risk. In other words, if you're going to invest money in a country, say South Africa, can there be shocks that reduce the value of your investment? Managing political risk is a hugely important issue for investors, which means they put an awful lot of money and resources into trying to do it. Mark Rosenberg is the CEO of a company called Geoquant. He's also an adjunct professor at Columbia University. Professor, good afternoon to you. Welcome back to Newsfeed. You've been predicting a big spike in political risk in our country for some time. Why did you make that prediction? What made you think the levels of risk would be high?
So the underlying drivers really in the model were social, meaning the social conditions in South Africa around the most recent COVID lockdown, around the electricity shortages coming into the winter season, around some contentious wage bargaining that generally occurs in the winter season, and finally the elite jockeying that has been going on in the ANC. All of those indicators suggested to us that overall political risk in South Africa was rising into July, even while some of the policy developments that we saw in June around privatization of SAA and the reform around Eskom and allowing more private electricity generation were positive. And that was reflected in the markets in terms of the value of the rand. Their social indicators were showing that, in fact, South Africa was heading to a much higher risk environment in July.
Was it actually possible to predict what kind of events would happen, that it would involve violence, for example?
So in general, you can, in that looking at history, general social unrest in South Africa has looked somewhat similar in that you do have violence in peri-urban areas that involves generally some degree of looting and violent protests, and then generally some kind of xenophobic or anti-migrant violence. So I think you can get a sense from history of what the type of violence is. The triggering event is always, of course, extremely hard to predict. But in this case, given the elite jockeying and the elite dynamics within the ANC, the legal dynamics around former President Zuma are a sensible trigger for that kind of unrest when the conditions are what they are.
I mean, I suppose, for example, there's certain things that are common. I remember speaking to a historian of pandemics who spoke about how after a pandemic you often have social change and this kind of social, we can use the phrase unrest. We've seen that actually in the United States to an extent. We see it here too. There's a commonality there.
Exactly. I think that's a core dynamic. We have seen social unrest become, either higher risk or actually to materialize, right, in a range of countries in light of the dynamics around the COVID-19 pandemic. I think the early waves of the pandemic, in some sense, reduced social tension just because of various lockdowns. But at this stage, with third and fourth waves in some countries, a lot of that social tension is erupting.
How do you put all the factors together? You must have some sort of formula or some sort of equation. When I hear the phrase quant is applied to business, I sort of realize this is often a language that I don't speak. It's high-level mathematics. But you must have some sort of equation that helps you put it together.
We do, and our background, and we don't pretend to have a crystal ball. Politics and political risks, of course, are quite difficult to predict, but they can be modeled using the tools of political science, which is really where we come from, and as well as some latest tools in technology, which allow us to fuel those political science models with a lot more data and to assess that data a lot more objectively than you typically would when trying to assess something as opaque and often subjective as politics.
I would imagine that what you do, it's not magic. You're not, as you use the phrase, looking into a crystal ball. It's science. Yeah. And the reason I say that is that if you can do it, Professor, I'm sure other investors do it. You'll have competitors in this field. The point I'm making is that then our leaders, people in our police, military services, they should be able to do it too.
They do, and I think many, we have clients in the public sector among government agencies, and often there are similar tools being employed to try to gauge these kinds of things. It's often politically difficult for governments to do so in their own government, right? They're somehow better at gauging conditions in other countries, because that's less impactful on the incumbent and less significant in terms of what that might mean politically for the government in power. And so I think governments do have significant capabilities to do this, and some do it better than others. But in general, looking inward is usually more politically fraught for a government agency to do than to look outward.
No one wants to go and tell the president that your policies have created this, I suppose, is what you're saying.
Exactly. Exactly.
Are you able to make predictions from this point for South Africa?
Yeah, so our data indicated that when the violence first broke out, that they would dissipate within a few days, and that does seem to be bearing out. But the underlying conditions that precipitated the unrest, right, have not changed. And again, with the issues we were discussing earlier in terms of the underlying factors, those do seem to be increasing in impact. And so our models, right, our data would suggest that these kinds of instances of social unrest will continue in the future, right, driven by different triggers. And so it doesn't paint a particularly optimistic picture going forward. However, I should say South Africa is unusual in our model in that it has, while it has very high social risk, what we call social risk, it also has very relatively low governance risks, particularly around things like the rule of law and such. And so, one of the reasons why this violence seems to be unfolding is that the former president has been, arrested. That in itself is an exceptional event in many countries, and emblematic of a certain institutional strength. And those kinds of factors continue to look quite good for South Africa in our model.
I mean, there's a lot to this, and I suppose what you would want to do is that we could take your model, well, I couldn't, but someone could, and look at your risk factors, and then you can immediately work out what needs to change. I mean, it's easy to say we need to employ more young people, very hard to do. It's easy to say that we need to reduce inequality, again, very hard to do. It's hard to take money from rich people, they fight back. So, I mean, what that really means is we've got to work on what we can control. I don't know what factors we really can control.
Well, that's generally the business of government and not the analyst. But I think you're right, and I think it's structural conditions are very difficult to change. But I also think that again, South Africa is an example of where political institutions have changed, social dynamics have changed. It's taken time. The effects are varied, right? But I don't think it's to say the status quo will prevail forever.
Well, I mean, the one thing I would like to suggest is that one of the things South Africa has is transparency. You can actually see what's going to happen. You can judge the mood of people. You can look at Twitter. You can listen to talk radio, whatever it is. You can't do that in some other countries.
Exactly. And again, that speaks to what we would call kind of a relatively low level of governance risk, right, around issues like civil liberties and democratic governance, rule of law in South Africa, relative to countries that have similar levels of social risk as South Africa, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, in Southeast Asia, et cetera.
Mark Rosenberg, CEO at Geoquant and Adjunct Professor at Columbia University. I really appreciate the time. Very interesting. Thank you very much indeed.